So Trini knows this, but this past weekend, my family and I voted for the first time. It was the Lebanese parliamentary elections, and it was the weekend where the diaspora votes. And it was such a, I struggle to put it into words because it was such a emotional thing to do. It was the first time that my parents have ever voted. It was the first time that like my sisters and I have ever been engaged in like in Lebanese politics and actually doing something like this. And so we walked away feeling like we really accomplished something. But I remember telling Tarini leading up to this day that there was so much not hype, because I feel like that's not the word that I want to use, but there was just a lot of excitement around this day and like the diaspora being able to vote just because our government is so corrupt, that there have been a lot of grassroots movement in terms of getting information accessible and getting people informed on how to vote. So there was this questionnaire that I filled out that literally took me, I'm not even exaggerating, 3.5 hours because of the depth of these questions and the amount of detail that was in them. So my mom and I were going through them, and it's just so crazy. I basically got a crash course in Middle Eastern politics as a whole. And one of the things that was brought up quite heavily in the questionnaire was what's happening in Palestine. And I know we've talked about it on this podcast before, and obviously like we talk about it off of the podcast, but it's just so surreal to be coming off of this weekend where we're voting and then hearing the news about the Palestinian journalist that was murdered.
Yeah. It's so devastating. But I find it interesting, like, because when I talk about India and I talk about politics, like, I don't, like, what's the word in English? Like, I don't make it mine, if that makes sense. But when you talk about Lebanon, even though you haven't been there for so long, you're like, our government, which I find so interesting because I don't, like, I it's not that I disassociate with my identity or anything, but I don't feel like that's my government. Like, it doesn't work for me. I don't know. It was just like interesting that you said that. But it is like devastating. And I think there was so much like I was saying this too, where, of course there's so much, like any government, any type of voting you ever do, in terms of like elections or government or whatever, there's like an anticipation to see who's going to win. And there's an anticipation of if it's the person that you voted for. And there's also like some level of like having to concede or accept if the person that you wanted does not win. But I think I was saying this too, it's so much, I can imagine that it's so much harder because you're waiting with like bated breath, not just because it's like, oh, the person that I want may not win, but it's also like, will it be fair? Like, will this election be fair? Like, will the government, like the current government that's in power, will they try to like rig the election, or will there be election fraud? And even when we talk about those concepts of like election fraud or whatever, we in like North America, other it, like, we're like, oh, that happens in like places like the Middle East or India or whatever, but election fraud is widespread within North America. But when you think about it, or you think about a corrupt government, you don't immediately think of North American government.
I think like when anything, you like North America is not the first place to come to mind. Like I think that's so interesting what you were saying, by the way, about it, like the language of our government versus like, that's not my government. I don't know why I use it. I think in a way it's like, maybe it I don't know, like I was going to say legitimizes them, but that's obviously not what I would want for that to be. But it's kind of like accepting this is the situation that we're in, this is our government, but that's not the government that we want. Like almost like I don't have we haven't had the control really.
Yeah.
in being able to have a say in who our government is. Anyways, I'm going on a tangent, but
No.
I think you're totally right. That idea of like comparing, it's like we put the West and North America on this pedestal as an example to everything, and everything outside of that quote example is othered.
Yeah. No. It's also just like it's so I don't know what the word is, but like it is something that is so prevalent or like something that we see happen like so often or like even in passing with everyday things like everyday sort of like social inequities that you witness, whether it's like poverty or and it like sounds bad to be like an everyday social inequity is poverty that we witness, but at the end of the day, unfortunately, it's true. And I guess that's the point is that poverty is everywhere. But like when you think about poverty or you think about like people dying or you think about people not having access to education or the very like real life situations that people face in North America, like nobody sees it as a North American, as an issue within North America. Like I was talking to this guy a little while ago and he was talking to me about I don't know. We were talking about how like education has been democratized and it was a very interesting conversation
Mm.
because essentially we were talking about how now like education is on like YouTube or whatever. So like he had learned coding entirely on YouTube. And he was talking about how like it like really empowers people to like be able to learn things on their own time to be able to like better themselves, whatever. And then we were talking about like all of the other things where you have to have access to like Wi-Fi or a computer
Mhm.
or even the time or whatever the case might be. But it was interesting because I was like, yeah, but like First Nations communities like don't have access to that. And he was like talking about like, you know, he was trying to be like, oh, like parents or single moms or whatever, like in like developing countries or living in poverty. And I was like, absolutely. But it also happens like in our backyard. I was like, you don't have to go, you don't have to like
No.
have this thought of it being like this thing that's so far away and that's so like unimaginable because it literally happens in our communities and in our neighborhoods.
Some of the worst examples can also be within our own community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like the first of all, that was like news. That was like he was like, "Oh my God." Like he was like, "Really? Like there's only like one high school for like however many
Yeah.
kilometers or whatever. There's no access." And I was like, "Yeah." I was like, "That is how it is." Um but it's really interesting because like when you like all of these things that you talk about the response it elicits when it is something that's in North America is so different than the response you get when it's in other parts of the world.
Mhm.
And it has obviously been so normalized in other parts of the world,
Yeah.
literally because of intervention from
The
North
West.
America, specifically the US and like the UK because of like colonization, but whatever. Um, that it's like, it's such a like, it's like, I think you were saying this, you were like, this is like the greatest, I think it was you. You were like, it's like the greatest marketing. Was
It
this
might have
you?
been me.
I can't remember because I feel like I was having this conversation with somebody else, but they were like, but it was like if the US has like taught us anything, it's like the greatest marketing. It's like the US has like plundered all of these countries, not even just communities, and has like left them desolate. And
Mhm.
then but everybody is still like US, land of the free, like
Yeah.
land of possibilities, like and it's like but it's first of all off the backs of all of these other awful things that it's done and two it's still not.
Yeah. I'd let it, it's still not like, let's not forget that abortion is like at stake in the US, like
Yep.
the land of the free for who?
Yeah, who is
For
free?
whomst? For
The same
whomst?
people that are free to continue to plunder all the other places and
It
make it
is
all free.
it is very crazy. I think like, watching everything that's happening in Ukraine and like the very understandable and rightful global
Of
response.
course, yeah.
It's crazy to think, um but at the same time where is that same and equal response for other countries that are going through something similar and have been going through something similar? Like, I can't help but compare it against what's happening in Palestine, and like that's been happening for years. What I find so ironic is that the same language that's used to describe what's going on in Ukraine is not the same language that will be used to describe what's happening in Palestine
Yeah.
or other places that are being occupied. It's just
Yeah.
it really is. It's like it's very like choose your fighter.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you just
And
it's not like a pick and choose what you want to, what side, not what side you want to be on, but like what stance you want to take.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I have like two things to say about this. My first thing to be like pick and choose the things you want to participate in because like I think an argument to that is like, well, if you care about one thing, you don't have to care about everything. And that's like 100% valid. If you care about one thing, it doesn't mean you have to care about
Fair.
everything. If you spread awareness about one thing, it doesn't mean you have to spread awareness about everything. But it's just interesting because if you can understand the politics and the systems of oppression that keep Ukraine occupied, for example, you can understand how those exact systems of oppression function in keeping other countries occupied that are not filled with white people.
Yeah.
But and not explain it away by being like, oh, but like that's India. Oh, that's Palestine. Oh, that's the Middle East. Oh, that's whatever. And I think it's so interesting because people don't understand then like the race politics at play there, which are so evident. But it was so interesting because when people talk about like politics a lot, like they'll be like, I'm fiscally conservative in Canada at least, although in the US as well, but whatever, I'll speak in terms of Canada. They'll be like, I'm fiscally conservative, but I'm like otherwise liberal. And I always say, I'm like, that's literally not possible because all that means is that you don't believe in funding social welfare and social like causes. And I was on a walk today and I was like I was just like walking around my neighborhood and it was so funny because or not funny but like I walked by this like whatever somebody's house and they on their lawn had like a conservative like lawn sign
Mhm.
and then right beside it they had a like free Ukraine whatever like Ukraine flag.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's so interesting because if you're voting conservative, then you understand that that means like less immigration. That means that refugees aren't allowed to come here, but you don't make the connection between that for people from Ukraine. You make that connection for people from Syria. You make
Mhm.
that connection for people fleeing the global south,
Yeah.
but or the east, but not what is thought of as the west. And I was like, that's like, it was so funny. That was like literally one of the things that I thought about to like when we were talking about like what our podcast, like that was like one of the things that came to mind because I was like, it's and like people will not, I think, even if they listen to this, understand like the race politics
Yeah.
that come into play because it's literally white bodies or like white narrative. I don't know what the word is, like white narrative that's being centered versus like racialized bodies.
A perfect example what is when we were when it was in the beginning of what was happening in Ukraine, um, these journalists from like very reputable sources were coming on television and saying things like,
Yeah.
it's so shocking to me that people who look like us have to go through this, as
Yeah.
if like war is only isolated in
Yeah.
places like the Middle East or in the East in general.
Yeah.
Like it was so blatantly racist that it was almost
And
I,
people,
I like laughable.
yeah, like, and people, like, I remember, like, news reporters would be like, well, this isn't like, this isn't Syria. Like, this is
This isn't, yeah,
Afghanistan. Like, why would that happen in Ukraine? Like, this isn't Iran. And you're like,
it's very ignorant. It's very, 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 very ignorant. And the way that like again, like this isn't to take away from the very needed
oh,
support that is required, but I was in freaking Erie, okay? Airy.
I know.
And I went to make my purchase, and they said, "Would you like to donate money towards the
Yeah.
Red Cross for Ukraine?" And like that's amazing, but like how else are we supporting other countries that are going through this? And you know, that it's like I don't have the words, but I'm like, retail is freaking getting into this. Like retail is now like, let's like all rally up together and put an end to occupation.
Stop it.
Stop occupation. Like I don't understand. Also, it is like, I'm with you. You're right. You can have um a perspective on one thing and like be focused on that one topic and be passionate about it, and you don't have to be like the expert or know absolutely everything else that's going on, but you cannot have opposing views on the same topic.
And because of where that topic is coming from, like literally
It's centered.
geographically where that topic is
Yeah.
coming from. It's ignorant, but I always say this, I'm like, ignorance just isn't an answer, isn't an acceptable answer. It
No.
never was, but it especially isn't now. And not only is it ignorant, it's like very violent,
Yeah.
right? Like it's a very violent mindset because you're basically saying that you're desensitized to the violence and massacre and genocide that occurs in other parts of the world because those people don't look like you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pick
Okay.
and choose. It's pick and choose. Even just okay, so let's if we jump into the Palestinian journalist that was murdered this week, Shireen Abakli. I do not personally have the privilege of watching her as I grew up, but she is someone that my dad would watch for years. For years. She was a pioneer for Palestinians, and she was the Palestinian voice. And so what is interesting to what'll be interesting to see is that she was an American citizen, and how the American government is going to treat this investigation of her death or
Yeah.
her murder. And that's even something that's like, how to like the pick and choose. Like, how are you going to pick and choose this?
Absolutely. And you know what I find like an added complexity or layer or intersection, whatever you want to call it, is there's like so many times when like women journalists have been killed or get like immense like rape threats and like
Yeah.
death threats for like speaking out about the government. And oftentimes there have been like many stories of people, of women, sorry, whether like obviously this Palestinian journalist was killed, and then there have been many other like journalists who are women who have also died or gone missing or have like been tortured. And I remember at the beginning of when everything was happening in Ukraine, and like reporters and journalists that were there were being like flown out.
Yep.
And then when people were going back, it was the primarily what you were seeing were like male reporters who were going back.
Mm.
And so it adds like another complexity that of like women who are further unsafe in conflict and
Yep.
in war and genocide and whatever, like it's an occupation, like it's women who are, I don't want to say who face the brunt of it because I don't know the statistic on this. I don't know the statistic on like the number. I mean, although you can argue that if you were to like look at it relatively of the number of women who get killed versus the number of men, and then compare that to the number of women and men in journalism as a whole. I don't know what like census study I'm like trying to conduct over here, but like, you know what I mean? Like I almost have no doubt that it'll be
Mm.
disproportionate
For
when,
sure.
and it's so heartbreaking and it's so, I don't even like have the words. I don't really have the words to even describe it, but
Yeah.
it's like an entire narrative that is essentially, not essentially, that is being erased and has been erased for so long because like women don't have you know, women aren't allowed access to education in all parts of the world. And like lack of access to education impacts women most. When you have a country that is war torn or that is occupied, a state that is occupied,
Yeah.
who does that impact the most? It's women and girls.
Yeah.
And it disenfranchises women and girls the most when any of this happens. And so it's just like really, people always talk about like, oh, but things are better now. Like things are better now. And I want to be like, for who are they better? For whomst
Yeah.
are
For
they better?
whomst.
Because it's the people who were marginalized before continue to be
Mm-hmm.
and continue to be like the stepping stones for other people to for white people to continue to like do whatever it is that they're doing or do whatever it is that they want to do. And I can just like hear somebody listening. I can hear somebody listening to this episode and like having a counter, like having a like a counterpoint being like some version of like, well, not all white people or like whatever, but I just think that there is not enough of a stance or not enough of like a collective reckoning of the system by the people who uphold it, whether they know it or not.
Yes. I agree. I'm like not hesitant, but I'm processing what you're saying.
Yeah.
Two, I can't even tell you what that reckoning looks like.
Yeah.
Like for example, like we have our provincial elections coming up. I'm gonna vote NDP.
Yeah. Me too.
We're both gonna vote NDP, but I'm gonna vote NDP knowing that that ideal outcome that I'm looking for is so far from what will happen.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we will ever in our lifetime get to a point where we will see that outcome, where it's like we're out of this two-party system, a majority two-party system.
Yeah.
And, you know, we are able to introduce more of, members from these types of parties that we align with into our government, because it just seems like there's this like massive blockade and no one can get in except the two parties that currently hold control. And so I can't even tell you like what a reckoning looks like. And the same thing for, Lebanon. Like I was telling you this, and it sounds so silly, but like after the weekend and all of that like excitement, I guess, sort of like went down, and we were back at a at a regular pace.
Yeah.
It just dawned on me that this isn't a one-time thing. Participation in elections is not a one-time thing. Like this is something that my family and I are going to have to keep up. We can't just choose to,
Sit out 1 year.
sit out 1 year or only participate because it's trendy. Like, like this is like a commitment that we have to make. And that commitment might not necessarily come with the outcome that we're looking for
Yeah.
ever.
Yeah.
But does that mean that we stop participating altogether?
No, of course not. And I think that's like kind of what I was, when we were talking about it after you voted, like that was like one of the things that I was trying to say, where I was like you obviously put it in like a much like you said it much better than I did, but like it is a commitment, and it's not just a commitment in that you have to continue to vote. You have to continue to fight for like what you believe in and like
Mm-hmm.
what you believe to be right and true, and the hope, like I think the hardest part is like the hope you continue to have every single time you vote, that this will be the time that there will be less voter fraud, or
Yeah.
the election will not be rigged, or not be rigged or whatever. But you know what I mean? Like that hope is something that you have to continue to like harness and harvest, for lack of a better way to say it. But another like piece of that, or another part of that, is like when people don't vote,
Mm-hmm.
for example, in Canada, when like you and I have released like a few episodes aside from
I
manifestation,
was just gonna say.
aside from manifestation, um the episodes that we have released have been about like the importance of voting, and like how how you need to vote, and like how you need to vote I think at first, I still struggle with this idea of like strategic voting.
Me too.
And I think I sent you something today um on about it, or like on strategic voting, and it was about like, I don't know why people still should strategically vote, whatever. I think I'm just going to vote NDP because I
Yeah.
want to see that change. Like that is the change I want to see. Like those are the people that I want representing me
Yeah.
in government. But it's so hard because there's people who just will not vote, who don't even care about voting, and they're like, I'm not going to vote. And that's it. Like I don't know either. I don't know enough about it, which again, ignorance is just not something you can claim anymore when for people from specific, socioeconomic backgrounds, like information is very accessible to them. Um, and overall, I think you can argue in general, information has become more accessible.
Yes,
Um,
especially when it comes to elections. Like, I don't know if you remember,
yeah,
there was like a full spreadsheet
yeah,
the last time there was an election, I think on the federal level, and it was like every point and where every single candidate stood. And
yeah,
all you had to do was Google it.
yeah, yes. Yeah, and I just mean like in terms of like, I don't know, like people not having access to
Oh,
computers,
yes.
right? But like, but
Yeah.
no, but you're right. Overall, it has
Yes.
just become more accessible in general, but people still will just not vote. Like I actually have like someone that like my family knows, and she'll just be like, I don't want to talk about politics because like I'm not voting. And I'm like, that is a privilege in itself where you think
Yes.
that not voting is not going to affect you, or the outcome of an election is not going to
Yes.
affect you. So that's like one form of privilege in and of itself. But the other idea that like you literally squander away something that people are like dying for. And it's not that you only understand the value of something because somebody else doesn't have it, or you understand the value of something because
Yeah.
you can do it and somebody else cannot. But like just truly that you don't understand like the importance or how the weight it carries to be able to vote and not be scared for your life when you go to vote. Like you were even
100%.
telling me like trying to get your passport to vote, they were trying to like delay it, like you
Oh my
like
God.
maybe like whatever. And it's like you are far enough removed, but the reach of like corruption, that sounds so fucking
Yeah.
intense, but like the reach of corruption is like so widespread and so strong that it has reached you here, where you're
Yes.
like, having to figure out how to get this done in order to be able to vote.
Yes.
And when I was talking to your mom, like you guys were talking about how when you actually go to vote, there's like somebody from each like party
Yeah.
or whatever you were trying to explain to me that
Yeah.
is there, who is trying to be like, no, vote for us, like trying to convince you on the spot. Like that can be so intimidating.
Yes. Then actually, I don't think I told you that they were there. They
Yeah,
were
yeah,
like,
yeah.
it was so weird because obviously we don't have, like, you would never
You're not
ever
allowed
have
to,
that here. But
because
like,
it's literally voter intimidation. But
it's
like
voter intimidation.
exactly, but that's exactly what it is, right? Like the reach of this corrupt government
Yeah.
is so like I literally think of somebody with like an arm, and it's like so long, this reach, it's like so far
Yeah.
that it's like affecting you, and however far removed you are, or
Yep.
how just far in general geographically you are from Lebanon. But like again, and that's not to say that doesn't happen in the States, because it does,
Mhm.
obviously we know that it does, but then people will just be like, I'm not going to vote. And like not, I think, disseminating information to
Mhm.
very specific groups is something that politicians and governments do, so that they can continue to feed the cycle of misinformation, so that
Mhm.
people continue to vote for them. But again, like who does that impact the most? It's like racialized women and like
100%.
marginalized communities, because that access to education, resources, blah blah blah, is like so much easier for affluent communities, which is, often more often than not, like primarily white communities.
100%. I get emotional every time I vote for anything. I could be honestly voting on a survey on Instagram and I will start
Like teen
crying.
choice of words, I'm crying.
I will friggin' start crying. I will, like, there will be a poll somewhere of like, what do you like more? Cries. Like, I will just be in tears. I don't know why I find it so moving. I think because I think because the weight of it really sits with me. Like anytime you cast a vote, no matter like whether it's here or whether it was the one in Lebanon. Obviously, the one in Lebanon had a little more weight just because it was the first time, but
A little.
just
Then an Instagram poll, just a little.
then the Instagram poll comes next.
Yeah.
But I think just there's such a power in having your voice heard, and it's you hit it, you hit the nail on the head. Like it is a privilege to sit back and be like, whatever the outcome,
I'm
I'm
gonna,
an outlier.
yeah.
Like I will be fine anyway. And it's like it really is, if anything, like it's just like a small finite amount of time of your day that you take to vote. Like if you go early, you're in and out in 15 minutes
Yeah.
max.
Yeah.
Max. And
No,
like really what did that take away from you?
no, I know. I also just think like talking about this idea of it being like a privilege and how it's like inaccessible. Like this is not just the first time that you voted, which okay, you
Mhm.
can argue it's because you were like removed, you moved here when you were young, blah blah blah, which I know is not the case, but whatever. But it's the
Mhm.
first time that your parents voted.
Yes,
And like
exactly.
that really speaks, at least to me, to what a privilege it is to vote. And like part of why they didn't vote was because there was a war going on. Like they didn't just like not vote because like I'm good, like, oh, never mind. They didn't vote because there was literally a war happening.
There was no
There was no election.
opportunity. Well, it was either there was no opportunity to vote or there was no vote for people in the diaspora.
Yeah.
So last election, I think was in 2018. I think, and honestly, I could be wrong about this, but I'm 80% sure in my freaking like questionnaire that I had to take. I'm 80% sure that this is what happened. In 2018, there was a parliamentary election. So the exact same thing that happened this year happened in 2018. And the diaspora was allowed to vote, but they were only allowed to vote for 6 seats out of the like 128 that is in parliament. So imagine that like tiny amount for almost 4 million people that are out of the country, which is insane
Which
to
is
think.
insane, which is
Yeah.
insane to think about because like again, that's another way to like that's like voter oppression and another
Yeah. That literally is what it is, like voter suppression. So um this time around it was really moving because my parents, it was not only their first time voting, but it was their first time voting with an equal amount of power as they would have back home.
yeah. 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 Like and then there's people here who are like, "Oh, I'm just not going to do it."
I'm just not going to do it.
And it's not because it's like they can't take time from work. It's not because they don't have access to whatever. It's like
Yeah.
literally just them being like,
Even like what you and I were talking about this, like I was talking about, we were talking about the outcome of the Lebanese election, and I was saying that, I'm hopeful for a better future, but I'm not putting my hopes up that like the government's going to completely, like flip and it's going to be something else. That's just not, anyone who says that is foolish. Like that's
yeah,
just not what's
yeah.
what's going to happen. There will be small wins here and there, but
Yeah.
it's likely that it'll stay the way that it is. But we think about the privilege of having our elections here, and you never have to think about that. Like you never have to think about, um are their election results going to be corrupted? Are they going to be interfered with? Like do I have to worry about like an like a government takeover, which is kind of crazy because you can't necessarily say the same in the States. But
Yeah.
I go and vote here with a sense of comfort that like, yeah, I can confidently say that this is a free and fair election, that my voice is being put to use.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. I think it's just like a very messy, like, like it's just like it's very hard to like speak to people who like decide not to vote or who say things like I am when I do vote, it's like I'm like fiscally conservative, but otherwise I'm liberal. Because also when like you say you're liberal, you're like very like centrist left. You're not like left, right? So like,
Yeah, exactly.
so I find it interesting when they're like, no, I'm left, but I'm liberal. And you're like, that's like centrist left,
Better.
whatever.
Also, I just, sorry not to cut you
Yeah.
off. I would love for someone like on Hinge or Bumble or whatever to have "I'm fiscally conservative and socially liberal" as their bio and match with Tarini, because I would love to see her chew them out. Like, what the fuck is this? Swipe left.
I would swipe. I would not accept them. Um, yeah. I mean, that is like a whole other topic, a whole other. But I just mean like I think I like really like struggle with people's reactions or like their understanding of like this is gonna sound so vague. It's like us talking about global affairs, but like conflict in the world.
But actually,
But
but
actually,
global affairs.
the global, like actually global affairs. Like,
Yes, yes. You know what it is? It's the connection of the global affairs.
yeah, it is. We're back to global affairs
We're
because
back.
it has been however many years it's been. And global affairs are still affairs globally. So
They're affairing globally. Is that what you just said?
well, that's what they're doing.
They're affairing globally. Yeah, honestly, fact.
Did I lie?
Did you lie?
Did I lie?
But did I tell you that I was fiscally conservative and socially liberal? I was gonna say socially irresponsible, but that doesn't make any sense.
That is
No.
that is actually like a funny like satire on I think what people think the liberal government does with like the budget. So it's like you like
Yes.
inadvertently made like a satirical joke. But anyways, I like the death of this Lebanese not politician, Lebanese journalist is like
Awesome.
very Palestinian, sorry. I think I said Lebanese earlier too. Palestinian is very heavy,
Yes.
but I not but and I think people are like desensitized to it
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
many ways. And like then like and it all kind of like ties together, right? Like
Yeah.
whether it is what like the systems of oppression or the structures of power that uphold you not needing to vote because you don't feel like it makes like a difference in your life, all the way to being desensitized of like things that happen in whatever is considered like the global east or the south.
Yeah.
it it's all upheld by the same thing. um and like not understanding the 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 like very multifaceted and like complex layers of that, whether it has to do with like gender or race or colonization, because everything is colonization's fault. It's really hard to like have that conversation constantly without feeling like either the person you're talking to is just like shut off because they're like,
Yeah.
oh, you're just like a socialist or whatever, and you're like, I'm not
Yeah.
a socialist, but what does it say about you if you think that if I'm not like you, I'm a socialist? And you just kind of feel like you're not getting through, and like people will never understand. Like very close friends of mine will not understand why it doesn't make sense for them to say that they are fiscally conservative.
On that note, if you live in Ontario, elections are coming up
Yep.
June 2nd.
Mark your calendar.
Mark your freaking calendar. I promise we didn't this episode was timed quite well. We were just talking about this.
Yeah.
It wasn't intentional, but now that we're on this topic, make sure you vote.
The
If you're
world
not voting, don't talk to us.
Yeah, literally. We're manifesting that you vote. This episode was manifested as in recorded by us, but it just so happened that it happened to be at elections and election season is here. So that's that.
You'll find me crying at the polls.
Yeah. Instagram and on June 2nd.